Imagine a world where just a trace of your ancestry could define your entire existence. This concept, known as the one-drop rule, has deep roots in American history and continues to influence our perception of mixed-race individuals today. Figures such as Barack Obama, Tiger Woods, and Kamala Harris are part of this complex legacy. Poet Langston Hughes highlighted in his memoir that, while in the U.S., the term Negro was applied to anyone with African ancestry, in Africa it referred to someone who was fully black. Today, we'll explore the history of the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule is a social and legal principle that became prominent in the United States. It dictated that any person with even a single drop of African ancestry was classified as black, regardless of their physical appearance. This rule is deeply linked with the history of slavery, segregation, and racial dynamics in America. It traces back to a 1662 Virginia law that established the framework for racial classification for over 3 centuries. This law meticulously defined the social status of mixed-race individuals. One notable historical example involves President Thomas Jefferson. Historical records and DNA evidence suggest he had at least 6 mixed-race children with his enslaved concubine, Sally Hemings, who was predominantly white and the half-sister of Jefferson's wife. Although these children had a predominantly European ancestry, which could have legally classified them as white if they had been born free, Virginia's laws of the time considered them enslaved because of their mother's status. In colonial America, racial classification was not just about physical appearance, but dictated one's very existence. Dark skin, broad noses, and tightly curled hair were seen as markers of social inferiority. This crude system enforced a rigid hierarchy. Whiteness meant freedom, and blackness meant enslavement. However, the reality was more complex. Racial mixing often blurred these strict boundaries, causing significant anxiety among those invested in maintaining white supremacy. Historically, racial mixing was heavily policed. For instance, in 1630, Hugh Davis was publicly whipped for his relations with a black woman. Such harsh punishments were common, reflecting deep fears of racial mixing undermining white control. This fear was compounded by eugenics and scientific racism, which promoted the idea of white superiority and viewed blackness as a contaminant to be controlled. Maintaining rigid racial boundaries was essential to preserving white supremacy, leading to the creation of segregation laws. These laws criminalized interracial marriage and, in some cases, even sexual relations. Although these regulations ostensibly aimed to govern interactions between different races, their primary focus was on controlling white behavior, ensuring that whites adhered to the constructed idea of racial purity while blacks were already enslaved. The impact of these laws extended beyond personal relationships and influenced legal definitions of race. Many individuals with mixed ancestry could appear white due to their predominantly European heritage, but the legal framework often defined them differently. For instance, in 1822, Virginia's law stated that to be classified as a mulatto, a term derived from the Latin word for mule, one needed at least 1/4 black ancestry. By 1831, new rules further restricted the freedoms of freed black people, but the one-drop rule was not immediately adopted. When proposed in 1853, it was initially resisted due to concerns about its impact on those already legally classified as white. However, by 1910, Virginia modified the law to include anyone with as little as 1/16 black ancestry, and by 1930, any African descent was enough to legally classify someone as black. In contrast, New Orleans developed a more nuanced approach to racial classification. The city established a multi-tiered system rather than a simple binary classification. Whites occupied the highest status, blacks the lowest, and between these extremes existed a group known as the Creoles of color. This intermediate status resulted from generations of mixing between whites, Africans, and indigenous people. In colonial Louisiana, interracial relationships were more accepted and sometimes encouraged, with Creoles serving as a buffer that helped whites maintain dominance while keeping unmixed blacks subjugated. Creole children often received acknowledgement and privileges from their white fathers, allowing many to ascend to elite positions. Despite their mixed heritage, many Creoles considered themselves superior to blacks. Louisiana's system became even more complex, with terms like quadroon and octoroon used to specify the exact degree of black ancestry a person had. This level of detail illustrates society's intense commitment to racial distinctions, even as the boundaries became increasingly complex. After the Civil War, Southern states enacted laws to enforce segregation and limit the rights of black people, including stripping them of their voting rights. Between 1890 and 1908, all former Confederate states passed these laws, which persisted until the 1960s. The concept of the one-drop rule became firmly entrenched with the 1896 Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, which upheld segregation laws and established the separate but equal doctrine. This ruling was prompted by the case of Homer Plessy, who was deemed black under Louisiana law due to having 1/8 African ancestry, thereby cementing the legal foundation for racial discrimination. From 1910 to 1930, states such as Tennessee, Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi adopted the one-drop rule, while others applied it in practice. This era was marked by the legal enforcement of racial segregation and the deep entrenchment of systemic racism in American society. Moving into the 1940s, figures like Walter Plecker in Virginia and Nomi Drake in Louisiana took the one-drop rule to even more extreme measures, distorting records and erasing the rich heritage of many families. Plecker's Racial Integration Act, passed in Virginia in 1924, prohibited interracial marriage and contributed to a long period of racial discrimination. As head of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics, Plecker was responsible for ensuring that all birth certificates included racial classifications, using his position to further eugenicist goals and target black and indigenous people. Despite this oppressive framework, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s began to dismantle legal segregation and challenge long-standing barriers. The landmark 1967 Supreme Court decision in Loving v. Virginia was a pivotal moment, striking down Virginia's ban on interracial marriage and the prejudice principles of Plecker's Racial Integration Act. This ruling marked a significant victory in the fight against systemic racism and the erasure of mixed-race identities. Interestingly, the one-drop rule was not unique to the United States. Similar concepts appeared in other societies with histories of racial mixing, such as Latin America. In Nazi Germany, the Nuremberg laws used a related system to determine racial classification, defining a Jewish person as anyone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents, rather than criminalizing marriages between Jews and non-Jews. Today, the legacy of the one-drop rule still lingers in societal consciousness. The case of Rachel Dolezal sparked a national debate about racial identity authenticity. The 2000 census marked a significant change by allowing individuals to identify with more than one race, reflecting a shift in understanding racial categories. The history of the one-drop rule illustrates the complexities and contradictions of America's racial history, showcasing how laws and social norms have crystallized racial boundaries that are essentially social constructs. It underscores the ongoing struggle to navigate and dismantle these rigid classifications in the pursuit of a more equitable society. Thank you for joining us on Ancient Histories Remixed. This has been the story of the one-drop rule. For more stories like this, visit our website. Please like, subscribe, and thank you to all our Patreon supporters. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. Peace.